Hello, welcome to the Tales and Tactics podcast. I'm your host, Troy. With me, we have Max, my co-host.
Hey.
And our producer, Jay.
Hello.
Today, we're going to be covering Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. This is a classic, and it goes right back to the origins of the Warhammer world and setting as we know today. This is going to be a deep dive on both the mechanics, the setting, and the impact of this game in addition to its origins. This is an important one as it is the start of the Warhammer Old World. This is where this idea begins and has its real genesis, and it's also the start of grimdark role-playing as we know it as well. So let's go ahead and dive right in on the origins.
All right. So, in a previous episode, we already talked about Warhammer Fantasy Battles, and as a sort of continuation of that, we're now entering the role-playing universe. Now, back in that episode, we talked about how the world wasn't really that established, but I'm going to just start off by giving a bit of a rundown of the publication history and how we get into the meat of this. So the game is created by Games Workshop in 1986, and they'd only just begun producing their own role-playing and game products. So before this, they had released fighting fantasy novels, and not the role-playing system quite yet, but the novels themselves, and they were a big hit. They had released two role-playing games prior to this. One, Golden Heroes, which was a superheroes game, not super popular. But then they released Judge Dredd, tied with 2000 AD Magazine's character. And that was fairly successful. And they also released Talisman, the board game, which even to this day is still a very hot board game. And so after having made all of this stuff, they had decided now with the team at GW being Richard Halliwell, Rick Priestley, Jim Bambara, and Phil Gallagher. Some of the products they were already selling well before they even made their own were Dungeons & Dragons. They had done a huge campaign to sell RuneQuest, which in the UK was the most popular role-playing game to this date. And they were also selling Call of Cthulhu and Traveller and pretty much every game that was popular around this time, but as a third-party seller in the UK. And seeing some of the weakness in selling those third-party products, they decided to make their own game. And the team got together, and the game they decided to make would be very much based on those products they were selling, particularly RuneQuest. So this was an in-house production, and this would be almost the last time that it would be this in-house. We will soon discover that Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay is the black sheep product of the Warhammer line. They developed it, they published it, and then the company, that being Games Workshop, decided to make a huge change in direction where they basically said, we are in the business of selling miniatures, and all of our games have to tie in with that. And so they set up a separate company called Flame Publications that would handle some of the role-playing, particularly Warhammer Fantasy role-playing. However, within just a few years, this basically fell apart. There were all kinds of ideas about how they were going to improve and put out supplements and do the whole thing that Dungeons & Dragons was doing, but it just ended up falling apart. And the game kind of languished in obscurity for at least a few years, until the strangest third-party development I think I've run into in a while. So I believe in 1994, they were approached by an Italian company called Nexus Edris, which requested the rights to print Warhammer Fantasy First Edition in Italy, in Italian. And so that was a thing. And then the next year after that, up-and-coming company Hogshead Publishing, which would become more important in the history of role-playing later, got their start by then becoming the next publisher for Warhammer Fantasy role-playing. So they began republishing the books, they reworked a lot of the modules that had already existed, and they released a bunch of supplementary books that basically became Hogshead's main line, kind of their cash cow, for pretty much the majority of that company's life. And so that was the full extent of that. And for 20 years, that one edition, maybe slightly less than 20 years, but like round about 20 years, that was the only edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay that existed that anybody would have access to, including large gaps where it wasn't available. So it's interesting that it was as popular as it was. And then eventually they got around to making a second edition, which was kind of a polished version. And for that, GW's Black Industries, which is now defunct, but part of the Black Library division, hired out a now well-established company, Green Ronin, to develop basically a revamped version of the first game. But interestingly enough, this game helped Green Ronin over the hump during the D20 crash. So this may be the black sheep of GW, but it has saved or made companies that have taken it on as a project. And a lot of people quite like the second edition. We won't get into the third edition, not because it's controversial, which it is, but just because that's beyond the scope of today's topic. From there, we can just get directly into the system. So, as I said, the game is heavily inspired by, I like to say it's a cross between Dungeons & Dragons, RuneQuest, with a little sprinkling of Call of Cthulhu in there.
You can really feel that Chaosium influence with the RuneQuest presence of profession and that skill system, and then the Call of Cthulhu just way that you interact with the world and that investigative sense that sometimes comes out in this game. It really feels influenced by those titles to me in particular.
Yeah, it's definitely a more paced sort of game. Even the combat is a bit more particular. But in the same spirit of that, it is a D100 based system. So that is typically rolling two D10s, one of them representing the first tens digit and the second one representing the ones digit. And it's a roll under your skill. So you have a target number on your sheet, which denotes how good you are at a thing. And then you try to roll that number or lower. And so as you gain skill, you increase the chances that you could be able to do that.
And this works pretty much exactly as it does in RuneQuest and Call of Cthulhu. In many respects, where you're always trying to roll under. And just like Max is saying, as you get better, your stats go up, which is very intuitive. And just once you wrap your head around the one being the best result you can get, you're good to go.
In addition to that, and this sort of, I guess, takes from... Actually, RuneQuest does this as well, and Call of Cthulhu, but the popularity of Dungeons & Dragons definitely pushed polyhedral dice. So this version of the game uses all the dice. D4s, 6, 8, 10, 12. Probably there are some situations where a 20 might get rolled. That one is actually a little bit rarer. But yeah, pretty much all of your funky dice come into play here. And then, Troy, maybe we can get into the characteristics.
Now, this is a really fun part of the game. This is where some of the Warhammerisms of the game stand out. You know what I mean? But this is the characteristics list of 14 different characteristics that you're going to have in the game. So there is, I'm just going to do them. First, you're going to have move. That's your relative movement speed. It works in grid spacing or in inches. You've got weapon skill. That's going to be your melee, obviously. Ballistic skill for your range. And that's baked right into your character. So those aren't skills. Like those are core straight attributes. Then you'll have strength, followed by toughness. Those are really important as they're referenced for core attributes, derivatives. And then you've got your wounds total, initiative, agility, dex. All of those feel like they might be the same thing, but they are separate in this title. Followed by leadership, intelligence, cool, willpower, fellowship, all sort of representing the social spectrum of your skills.
Yeah, absolutely. And that may seem very granular, but what they were attempting to do was to tie that into Fantasy Battles, which I think was either between its third or fourth edition by the time this came out.
And a lot of these skills, or attributes, I should say, kind of cross-relate to their peer in the Fantasy Battle game. And like cool, for example, is a classic old stat from the Warhammer games that in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay will later be made into a skill.
Yes. And a lot of what the theory behind this is that in Warhammer Fantasy Battles, your stats would be between 1 and 10. And in this case, it would be between 1 and 100. So in principle, it was easy to convert between the two systems. And the idea being that you could take your character from this game and put them into the battle game and take characters from the battle game and have an easy translation between them. was essentially the idea that they were trying to go with.
Well, when you even look at the pictures of the skirmish models in this game that they use in the combat chapter, they're on little bases just like a Warhammer model would be. So there's definitely an implied continuity between the two systems.
Yeah, and that kind of interplay between the different products that GW will be putting out, anytime we're going to touch on one of their products, you're almost guaranteed to see some part of it that connects into some other part.
Yeah, something is connected to something else. They're all related using either, the brother or sister of each other mechanics, or directly sharing setting, universe, or even interlocking directly.
Yeah, I mean, even with this game, there's 2 supplements for Chaos that come out later that directly address the battle game, this role-playing game, and even the Rogue Trader game, which would have just come out as well.
100%.
But moving on, so after that, the characteristics are determined by what race you pick. So in Dungeons & Dragons, you would roll all of your stats 3d6 down the line, and in most games, certainly AD&D, that wouldn't be really affected by race. Race would just be other elements like how you progress. In later editions, like 3rd edition, race might give a bonus. But in this case, the race determines what dice you roll and how much you add to it. So it narrows the spectrum around each of these characteristics.
That's exactly right.
Which I think is an interesting way of doing that. It certainly creates definition without restriction.
And you still get to roll down the line and have a really dynamic process of creating a character, but it is going to be weighted towards these different backgrounds that your character comes from.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's more skewed than necessarily definitive.
Yeah, exactly.
The game at this point still uses effectively Dungeons & Dragons classes, a little different. So there are 4 classes. And they are warrior. Oh, I'm going to have to look this up.
Rangers, rogue, and then last one is academics.
Oh, right. Yes. Which is sort of the catch-all for your anything that's knowledge-based.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And so within those, there are a series of, and this is maybe the most characteristic of this system. This is the thing that brings the shine to the uniqueness of this game, is the career system. So within each of these classes are a list of careers that then define the progression of your character. And these careers range between, I don't know, Troy, give me some examples of some of the careers that are available.
Let's get into it. Let's get into these careers. Agitator, artisan's apprentice,
right.
Bodyguard, druid. So some of these are even classes you might expect in other games. Entertainer, footpad, grave robber. So some of these are way more low level than your traditional paladin. You know what I mean? And like, you're not an important stalwart character in this. You're a herdsman or perhaps a jailer.
Yeah, there's the famous rat catcher.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
It's like, oh, okay. Where am I going from this in a game? So you're not picking these sort of heroic high-level archetypes, though there is sort of suggested through the class category. It's more about playing these sort of smaller professions that within each of them have their own progression with both your characteristics, and they provide skills and other abilities.
It really feels like Call of Cthulhu in the sense that you are a regular person. You can be a wizard, but you're not necessarily the chosen wizard. You are just a guy trying to learn from a spell book. And I think that gives a certain feeling of investment to your character, because they feel like, not like you per se, but they feel like someone that you can relate to in a really direct way. You don't have to think like, okay, what would Conan do? It's more like, what would you do?
Right.
And I think that's a really interesting context setter for you in this fantasy setting, which we'll get to later, but is very derived from our own history as well.
Yeah, it's a much more sort of grounded in history and ordinary people, might be a good way to put it.
Ordinary things, yep.
Yeah. So the game is ostensibly skill-based. There's an entire range of skills, each of them which you can, through your career, put points into that will then improve roles based on adding them to the appropriate characteristic based on a test called by the GM. That's the whole gameplay structure in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's I think you referred to it earlier as that's the method.
That is the method, yes. we were having a previous conversation, the difference between rules and methods. And the method is how you get the thing done. We can get into some of the rules of the game. So there are a series of spot checks that define different aspects of the game. We'll get into more of those in detail, but first I want to get into the rest of the characteristic elements, not necessarily characteristics themselves. So the game has fate points, which, I don't know, how would you describe it? It's like a death save of sorts.
Yeah, that's actually a pretty cool way to describe it. It is a way to keep yourself alive. It's what makes your character different.
Yeah, not necessarily different from the other characters, but from the regular people in the world.
Yeah.
It's an appointed sort of, fate is a good way to put it.
Exactly. So the fate dice system is a way to preserve your character in an otherwise very lethal system, because as we'll get to, when you get into combats, they can kill your character dead.
Oh yeah, and fast. So we've covered all the elements of a character. Now, progressing and advancing a character, as it's called in the game, is done by acquiring experience points, which would be similar to Dungeons and Dragons and other role-playing games. But rather than moving up to another level, you spend those points. And there is some denote about how many total you've gained, because that'll determine the overall progress of your character. But really what you're doing is piecemeal through your career, buying each of your skills, attribute increases, and working your way through your career until you can get to what are called advanced careers, which are essentially somewhat more important versions of the previous ones, which are called basic. And then from those basic careers, you can basically become more of what you would think of as a sort of archetypical hero. There's also an entire set of advanced magic casting careers, but we'll get to that when we talk about the magic system.
And now, when we want to talk about the test or the spot rules of the game, the first thing we'll cover is movement speeds and how that is handled in the game. So you'll have, as we looked at, a basic characteristic of your speed, and that's modified by effectively how fast you're going to go. You can take a cautious approach, which will be limited to in some environments, but that will allow you to be sneakier, navigate in tombs or urban environments. You have your standard for just walking or jogging around the environment. And then lastly, you can run. So if you're a base movement speed of 4, which is pretty standard for most humanoid characters, you would move at a cautious 2, standard 4, and a running 16. And again, this can be used to move on a grid, or you can actually just do this in inches using your Warhammer models.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a fair amount of detail to this. They denote a lot of this stuff on tables, which you could probably say, cautious move is half of standard and running is times 4, but they actually do spell out in every instance.
Yeah, they do. For every attribute that you could have, they tell you. So
I know.
They're not worried about your ink, but
no. It does. One criticism I do have of the game is it's a little bit dense. There's a bit of a wall of text, partly because of these things, but it is laid out very nicely, so you can tell a lot of the parts separately from each other. Yeah. So one of the other interesting rules that I spied when I was going through this was rules for destroying buildings. And this is absolutely something a wargamer would have thought of. But in terms of, say, in comparison to Dungeons and Dragons, there are usually some kind of test for, like, say, kicking a door in. And I think if you extrapolate from that, it's certainly from, like, older editions, AD&D may have been more explicit about this. There's essentially a certain way of getting through walls and doors. But in a lot of the instances in this game, they're basically saying, yeah, if you've got the right tools and the wall isn't that strong, like it's a mud brick or wattle hut, you can just hack through the wall and make your own door, which I found just the way that it was put in there was sometimes the way a rule is written into a book suggests that you should do this. In Dungeons and Dragons, in reading like OD&D and AD&D and even BX, they have, well, OD&D maybe not, and probably BX less, it would be harder to find, but AD&D, you could find like, oh yeah, okay, I have a rough idea how you'd break a wall down. But it's not like selling it to you as like, yeah, you should totally break a wall down.
Exactly. Yeah, it's fun. And you're right, it's totally a wargamer thing. Like, that's a big theme in this design is the mentality of the wargamer being applied to the problem of the role-playing game.
Yeah, these guys definitely spend a lot of time at the proverbial sand table, and that feels distinctly in whenever they write rules.
Yes.
And obviously in a battle game, that's not going to seem strange, but it definitely stands out in a role-playing game when you compare it to other role-playing games, particularly modern ones. Overall, I found the tests to be pretty intuitive. So they have a series of situations, like this is what it would be like to hold your breath and how long it would take to suffocate. And this is any skill or characteristic that you would apply to rolling to see if that doesn't happen. I think in that particular case is toughness. One thing that I did notice, and this is something I find characteristic of older style role-playing games, and I think it must come from something like a traditionalist board gaming mentality, is what I refer to as all or nothing styled tests.
Okay.
Where if you don't have that skill, now it's not saying that at the table this could be handled otherwise, but the way that it's written gives the suggestion that if you don't have that skill, you can't do that thing. I'm sure in practical function, like if you don't have driving skill and you try to get a team of horses moving, the GM presumably would roll to determine something. But it doesn't expressly say that. It basically says, like, cannot attempt. And, like, I know AD&D sometimes has elements like that. Certainly the idea about the thief having climbing skill, and so then people are confused. Oh, well, can the warrior climb? Like, can the fighter climb? And it's like, the way that it's written suggests that it isn't, even though you probably could just figure that out. Those sorts of quirks are characteristic in this game as well. But yeah, they've got a whole bunch of qualities and tests. They've got an entire list of poisons, which I actually thought was better than the one that I had seen in versions of Dungeons and Dragons, mostly in the way that they're described. A range of diseases. And in keeping with the influences of Call of Cthulhu, this game has insanity conditions and sanity tests, which says a lot about the setting.
Yes.
Which is still in a proto form, even at this point, but that will become more and more characteristic of not only the old world, but Warhammer more generally.
Well, yeah, it'll be a defining feature of future RPGs in this setting, especially in the sci-fi Warhammer 40k setting. Mm-hmm. I mean, the insanity rolls in some of those classic games like Dark Heresy, for example, are like, that's a cornerstone of that game. So it shows up here. This is the start. Poison, disease, and insanity are all handled as acknowledging they can have a big effect on the table, but they are encouraged to be handled, with care by the GM, and basically use them to make it even more dangerous of a world. And disease might not suit every table, but if you're going into a sewer as a rat catcher, that's a real problem.
Yeah.
Or not real, but, that's a problem I would imagine such a guy would have in a crazy place as that. So it adds a certain sense to the setting that I enjoy.
Yeah, and again, like any of these games, as I was saying about the all or nothing skills, it's really up to the table as to whether, like, how anything is resolved or whether something's included. Maybe you don't want diseases in your game. Maybe you don't want to deal with insanity. And it does kind of make the distinction that that's optional. So it's kind of nice to see that they're acknowledging that aspect. Then we will move into alignment, which is unique in this game. Well, it is and it isn't.
Yeah, very different.
So it's clearly borrowing from the Dungeons and Dragons alignment matrix, but it's thinking about these things in a very, very different way. Maybe Troy, you can kind of run us through those.
Okay, so the way the alignment works is it's based on your character. It's based on your role play of the character, as well as some of the non-mechanical aspects of your character, like what religion they may be a part of. But the big five in this game are law, good, neutral, evil, and chaos. So some of that might sound very Warhammer to you, especially chaos. However, the law is a really interesting inclusion on this list. And when you see that there, it definitely evokes certain fiction of the time that was popular with the audience that wrote this game. So, Max, if you could go in a little bit more on the influence from fiction that helps define this alignment system.
This is, I guess, alignment systems in general, which are kind of unique to D&D, but they do show up in games that fall out of that, like the first edition of this game. And they come in from, I would imagine in this case, they're probably taking most of their influence from Michael Moorcock's Eternal Champion series. So that would be the Elric novels and some of the other heroes that are tied around that, with the idea that law and chaos are kind of cosmic entities. Moorcock is partly inspired by Paul Anderson's Three Hearts and Three Lions story, which has this, I don't know that it, I mean, it has some explicit elements, but it's this sort of like dramatic tension between law and chaos that are fighting over this fantasy world that the hero finds himself in. And I think that a lot of what Moorcock did was take that and elaborate it into this mythology. And that mythology, well, especially in later editions of Warhammer, becomes way more like that. But here it feels more Moorcockian, especially the addition of law, which in later editions would probably be represented by Sigmar as a god. But in this case, it's almost like its own pantheon, just as chaos has its own pantheon.
Yes.
And when we get into the deities, we'll see that
100%, I think.
Basically directly. There are gods of law.
Exactly. And what's interesting too about these factions is they aren't really like motivations. They're more teams that you're a part of.
Yeah. They tie into certain agendas, if you will. So they have things that they're for and against. But it feels less like a sort of descriptive quality that the D&D 3x3 grid matrix of alignments would suggest. So, because in this case, we're dealing with that 3x3 grid with the different variations across it, with basically all the corners missing. So it's more like a cross, and there's not as much overlap between them.
Yes.
Partly because those corners aren't there, but also just the way that they've written it. So as you were saying, Troy, it has written more in the way that they're more like distinctive teams. I would say good and evil are a little bit more like a disposition, and neutral as well. Law and chaos feel a little bit more abstract. It almost seems as though the authors aren't entirely certain about how these things fit together. It's more descriptive than it would be in original Dungeons and Dragons as far as alignment is described.
Right.
But it's like they kind of get what's being said there, and obviously they're taking from the Moorcockian example, but they also don't 100% know exactly what it is that is being said, except that it's something about whose side you fight for.
So that would cover a lot of the basic rules as they relate to your character and how you interact in the world. But there still is another huge set of rules that we need to go over, and that would be the combat.
Oh, yeah.
So combat sequence manages to be both long and complicated, but it does give you a sense of depth to the fight. You don't just find out that you struck someone for some amount of damage. You know exactly what you did and how bad you did it. So it's in some respects it has a charm that's persisted all the way through to the current edition of this game in terms of the depth of the combat. But just to walk you through, you start with a roll to hit with your attacking character. Then, assuming you hit, you'll roll your damage. You'll then reverse the digits of your hit roll. You'll invert them to determine the body location that is hit, the body hit location. You then take a look at your target. You will deduct the armor that they have on the region that you hit from your incoming damage. That damage will then be deducted from their characteristic wound total. Finally, you'll resolve any characteristic effects if they apply. And that's just one strike.
Yeah. If you have multiple attacks after that, then you repeat the process.
And that's just one character. That's not even the whole combat. Everyone's doing that every round. Well, not everyone every round, but
any character capable of engaging in combat is doing this on a round by round basis. Yeah.
Exactly. So it is investing. It's very cool. I like it. I think it's a lot of fun when you get to see something that isn't just an outcome, but it's a pathway to that outcome. You don't know that you inflicted the killing blow, for example. you struck him in the face with your rapier, and there you go. That is the killing blow. And I like that. I think that depth is rewarding to the player if they can commit to what it takes in terms of time and commitment to finish.
There's certain things in here that I like, where, going back to our Boot Hill example, there's a sort of stopgap with as far as the damage to a particular body location. Like, for instance, reversing the digits means if you're rolling low, just to make a point about this, to roll low on the hit locations is actually a matter of the head being 1. So if you roll really well, you're actually less likely to hit the head, unless your skill range is quite wide. So essentially, if you just cross your skill barrier, then you actually have a higher chance of hitting the head if the digits are flipped. So it's neat that they require the same roll read 2 different ways.
Mm-hmm.
The damage would be taken from some combination of polyhedrals that are tied to the die. In the second edition, they actually simplify this down to just d10s, and different ways of adding or subtracting value, which what you'll notice with this game, if you look through all of its editions, the third one being a bit of an anomaly, but generally they're trying to take this method and streamline it repeatedly. Because clearly people like it.
Yes.
If you play Dungeons & Dragons, it's going to feel slower, but it's also going to feel more dramatic. And I think that can count, provided you have people who are willing to invest in that excitement of seeing where did you hit and how hard and did it knock him out.
And the crits are spectacular and fun, more than just a simple max damage, for example. So I'm a big fan of how this system works, and it also has winning and losing conditions in combat as well.
Well, it's simple and complicated, like the combat system, so it's in keeping with the rules in general. Basically, whether the GM is doing this, though it would be nice, having been a GM, I know, it's nice when the players keep track of things. But what is required is both sides need to track the total amount of damage dealt to each side, and at the end of the round, whoever has the higher one is given certain permissions to do certain things, like intimidate or threaten the other character off the table, or even do certain kinds of offensive roles where you can, like, essentially break or split up their numbers. It's a very wargamey kind of thing.
It is.
Troy and I have been actually getting ready to play a 4th edition game, and flipping through the book, discovered that 4th edition has found a way to slot this back in with what I think are called advantage dice.
Yes.
Which basically every time you hit something, whether defending or attacking, you get a little +1, and then in the next one a +2, and it causes this sort of shifting of the battlefield. But if you take damage, it's reset, and it feels like it's calling back to this winning and losing rule. Though that in 4th edition, as with any edition past this one, is a more streamlined version of some concept you're seeing here.
Yes.
With that, let's move into how magic works, which for this game is notoriously disliked from what I can understand. It's the one part of this game that seems to take the most flack by anyone looking at it presently or even when it came out. Mostly because it's cumbersome and somewhat punishing. It's going to be hard to describe this. I think it works, but it's kind of in the way that a lot of other games, being a spellcaster is extra bookkeeping. This kind of lets that get carried away in a way that almost makes you never want to do this.
Right.
But we can go through it. So there is magic in the game. It is accessed through magic careers, those being alchemist, wizard, demonologist, elementalist, illusionist, necromancer, and then you have your divine casters as cleric and druid priest, which is interesting because Troy made a note of a druid, but that's not the same thing as the druid priest. Weird, I know, but there you go. And all of these go 4 levels, as they would with most other careers, certainly advanced careers. Typically, your spellcasting ability is equivalent to the level of your spellcasting. So wizard level 1 can cast level 1 spells, 2, etc. The exception to this is the alchemist, who at first level can only cast what is called petty magic, which is the equivalent of a level 0 spell in D&D. I guess it would be called a cantrip. Then they progress as normal. But the alchemists obviously get other skills, mostly in identifying substances and making concoctions and potions. Through the progression of each of these careers, you gain magic points, which are what you use to cast. You spend those points to cast spells. The total of those magic points is called your power level, which is some denotion about how strong you are. But it isn't to be confused with what is called spell level, which is the spell's level itself. And then there's magic points and magic level. The terminologies by themselves get so noodly at this stage. I'm pretty sure a lot of people just skipped it. And even for the people that stuck around to read it, you'll find out why that wasn't necessarily worth it. Magic points are regained primarily through sleep or meditation, with the twist on clerics and druid priests being usually some kind of ritual that they have to do, but it's really just flavored. A big thing, and one of the major complaints in this that second edition attempted to remedy, was that clerics and druids, aside from having that particular thing and having a god that sometimes gets mad at them, are really not that different. They basically cast spells in the same way that all these other classes do. Whether you think that's a good or a bad thing, it's up to you. I tend to like it if there's a different casting type, that the caster feels like the magic is different or it's coming from a different place. I suppose one of the other things that makes them different is that they don't have to get their spells from books. They can have them sort of via divine intervention. But going to casting spells, so spells are cast by spending a requisite amount of magic points. In order to get the spell, you have to spend experience points as if you were buying a skill to then buy the spell. And then when casting the spell, you spend the magic points, and this is accompanied with words and gestures and sometimes material components. So again, similar to D&D, and it basically means that caster, if in-game they're unable to speak or move, inhibits the effect of the spell. I think in a lot of cases it just says it doesn't work. The material components are interesting, that when I looked at a lot of the spells, a lot of them were things you could find in the dungeon, which I thought was cool. A good example of that was, there's one spell that makes, I don't remember what it was called, but it basically was like a spell that agitated enemies to fight each other.
Oh.
And the material component was any part of a dead goblin. So that was a neat idea. So getting goblins to fight each other sounds pretty easy if you can kill one of them. And you have enough magic points, and you bought the spell. You can see why this is becoming a bit of a headache. Also, spellcasting takes 10 minutes at least, or thereabouts. So it takes longer than your average combat round. And if the spellcaster is interrupted via being hit, they lose the magic points and don't cast the spell.
That's kind of a brutal punishing system, as you're saying.
Yeah. When a spell is cast, in some cases, like say with a mind control or something like that, the target can attempt what is called a magic test, where they basically try to resist the spell. And if it's done to a caster, the caster can actually spend their magic points in improving the results of that test. I think it's 5% a piece. So 1 point makes that resistance 5% better. But the source caster, the person casting the spell, can do the same thing by spending more points on casting the spell. So they can make the spell harder to resist by then spending more magic points. It sounds like a wizard duel would be like a burnout after like one shot, partly because of the lethality of the game. But like, if you wanted to like mind control the wizard to do something, then eventually both parties would burn their magic points out, and then that would be it.
Yeah, trying to make or stop that from happening.
And when I get more into the progression of magic careers and how they get into the XP, you'll see why that's a horrible, horrible thing to happen to a spellcaster. Targeting is, some spells work within a range. That range can vary. It can either be an actual distance drawn, or in some kinds of enchantment spells, as long as each target is minimum 3 yards apart from each other, the spell actually hits the group. And that feels like a wargame spell, where you're like casting onto units, like, and I don't mean units, I don't mean a single person, I mean like a group. There is some element of that carries over into this, where like if there's a formation of guys and you want to like bless them, as long as they're in this distance and formation, it just works. I don't know that I'd apply that to every spell if I was designing it, but it's a neat idea for an option. But then to get into the magic careers, the entry-level careers are basically alchemist and wizard. It not including the druid and cleric, which they have their own obvious. They would basically be somewhat advanced, but fairly easy to enter through another basic career. But through alchemist and wizard, you can then get into what I guess are the advanced spellcasters, or specialists, I think as they call them, which are demonologist, elementalist, illusionist, and necromancer. When I was reading these, I got the distinction that elementalists are basically just battle mages. Illusionists, I mean, that's fairly descriptive, but it's still technically sort of deceptive battle magic. Necromancers are evil, and demonologists are morons, based on how dangerous the magic is. I was like reading through like demonologists, and I'm like looking through their spells. I'm like, no, this is bad. This is a bad idea. Like, you're playing a very risky character. I mean, that could be fun, but it could be a very short character lifespan.
Yeah.
If you went that way. Or it could be a really exciting thrill ride that just ends really abruptly. And then to advance in any of these careers, and this is sort of where the punishing, at least one element of the punishing comes in, punishing aspect of being a spellcaster, is that you have to pay for your spells, you have to pay for your MP advancement, so your magic point advancement, and essentially all of your, now this makes sense in an abstract sense, but all of your XP is going into spells and things that power spells. And though there are skills, there's really not a lot of incentive to take them in order to actually be good at this. Which, as I said, if you burn through your magic points, you're basically useless. So the only safe way to become a spellcaster would be to go into that career from another career later, so that you already have skills you can fall back on. Like, you maybe not necessarily a fighting class, but something where if I burn all my magic points out, I'm not just this fragile, weak person that will get wiped out in one hit. Because there's really not that much that you could do. Those spellcasting classes are really magic focused. The alchemist might be the only exception, but then very quickly just turns into the other ones.
Yeah, right.
Divine casters, they basically function more or less the same as the rest of them. There's a lot of stuff later in the book about gods and lore and worship, and there's a table where your god can get mad at you, and this is what would happen. And I wouldn't say, like, I've heard some people describe it as it being like not different at all, and I'm like, that's not entirely true. They don't go out of their way in writing them as being that different. You kind of have to put it together yourself, which from the way a book is laid out is probably not a great way to do it. I would have just put them in their own subsection within that. And those classes are all lumped together with all the wizards. And then there's another chapter later that then describes divine magic. Well, it's a subchapter that follows it. So that may just be a layout thing, but I know that in later editions, they made the divine magic feel different, which was an improvement. Also, the magic system being amended in the publication of this was this, I think it was called the Sorcery Supplement Rules, that for the entire history of this game, of its publication, well, not the entire, I can't remember at what point, but I think toward the end of the Games Workshop life cycle, I think when it became Flame Publishing, they basically had hinted that they were going to fix those rules with a supplement, basically make magic casting a little bit more easy to follow and less punishing in advancement. And that became a famous false promise until we very end of the publishing life cycle with Hogshead. And then with second edition, they then folded in better rules. So I can't remember what the book was called, but it was this within RPG circles at the time, it was a famous vaporware product that just didn't happen. And it was supposed to fix the magic, and it didn't. My favorite thing now, I've been dumping on the magic system quite a bit, but I will say one of my favorite things about this is when magic goes wrong, it has all kinds of nasty side effects, which are fun to roleplay. So it can kind of get mutated or give you an affliction of some kind. And I know other games have taken that, Dungeon Crawl Classics being a very good example. But one thing that I actually really like about this game is that it has what are called preparations, which are basically like remedies that wizards make in order to hide or downplay some of those curses that they gave themselves, which is really funny because then if you think about it, it's like wizards give themselves medical conditions, which they then have to perpetually take medicine to solve. Or in some cases, it almost feels as though they turn themselves into something like not a drug addict, but someone who's dependent on these remedies. And I just thought it took that idea of being cursed and it added a level to it that I'm like, oh, that's great. I love that.
It adds just another twist and complication to an already complicated class.
I know. If the rest of the system for magic was simpler, that would actually seem more interesting. But in this case, it just makes it more punishing. And then, yeah, the only last thing to say is that there's a cast spell skill, which basically denotes per level how good you are at casting a spell, which is effectively a rolled spell check, which I think Tunnels and Trolls uses a system like that. It's not fancy in Magic like D&D. I think a lot of people find that to be weird. Strangely enough, this game borrows the weird concept of alignments, but doesn't use the fancy in Magic system, which from trying to do it kind of like RuneQuest does it, but then making it even more complicated, shows why fancy in Magic is actually, some people like it because it's just easy. I use the spell, it's gone. I have to remember it again.
I've got to reload my spells.
Which sounds like a pain, and it is. But at the same time, it just makes it easier. Just, okay, I cast that, draw a line through that. Yeah, that's the magic system. And it's hard to say if it's as bad as I think it is. When I took the time to think about it, I realized how much I wouldn't want to deal with this just for the amount of things you have to keep track of. It's more pain than it might be rewarding. And the spells are, like, some of the higher, like, 4th level spells are pretty devastating, but a lot of them are not that different from D&D spells. Petty magic would almost seem to be, like, if you just wanted to have a little magic flair, I might just, like, oh yeah, I'll just take one career advancement in Alchemist and then do something else. And with that long-winded explanation out of the way, I'm going to pass it over to Troy, and we're going to get into the lore, which is probably also going to be very in-depth.
So when we get into the lore of this game, we start with the religion and belief chapter. There is a number of gods that you're going to be familiar with if you are aware of the old world setting in its later years. But here, different gods have different importance, and the pantheon of the old world looks a little bit different than it's going to later resemble. So we'll start off with Minan, the god of the seas. That's a classic Warhammer god, one that applies across the old world. They are venerated by sailors, by seamen, river folk, people of the water. Mor, god of death, is not an evil god of death. So you're not picturing someone like a necromantic figure or something like that. They're more of a shepherd of spirits and souls, and they do the rites of death and the funerary processes. Myrmidia is the goddess of war, and they are venerated in Tilia, especially. So they are, again, not like war is depicted under the guise of chaos, but more war through the eyes of honor and strategy. Shalia, goddess of healing and mercy, that again is a key god for pretty much the whole old world. Everyone looks to Shalia, and she is the key goddess of the harvest, things like that. Tal, god of nature and wild places, is a big deal in the central and east of the empire, when that is a faction later on of the old world, pardon me. And Tal is nature, wild places, very druidic in nature. And lastly, we have Ulrich, god of wolves and winter. But Ulrich is the god of wolves, winter, and battle, another god of war, really important in the north of the empire. And you're going to see them become one of the major players in the imperial civil wars that'll get played and picked apart in the setting. And lastly, we'll go to Verena, the goddess of learning and justice. Again, another god key in the south. The last of the gods here that you're wondering where are they is Sigmar. They're actually not that big a deal in this setting, at this time at least. They are the key deity of the empire. They're still seen as the founder of the empire, but they're not ascribed the same importance or dedication in the lore or in the stories that are told as the other gods we just went over, the core old world pantheon. And then that kind of brings us into sort of where the old world comes from. And it's very different than a lot of fantasy settings. And I think that's what's so cool about it. Like, you have sort of an expected origin point for most fantasy worlds. It's a creation myth. And there isn't a creation myth in this setting. How it works is much more naturalistic. You have this planet, and upon it you have elves, dwarves, humans, and halflings who are just progressing naturally. They're living their lives. They're hunters and gatherers, just making their way in the world. It isn't until the Slan, timeless, ancient, frog-toed lizard men from space who show up, see this life, are intrigued by it, and begin to get involved. So this book is going to give the most detailed origin story of the Warhammer world that is not necessarily invalidated by later works, but this is never given this attention again. So we see this sort of science fantasy introduction to the classical fantasy peoples and races, where elves aren't just, the most beloved of the gods who were brought to this earth. Elves were just the first of the people that were uplifted by the Slan, who began to become involved with the people on the planet. So we get an elaborate detailing of the Slan and their role in this, and this sort of sets up the process by which we're going to get the familiar characters that we know. So the Slan are first going to uplift the elves. The elves are in turn going to roll that down and help the dwarves, who in turn will roll that down and help the humans and halflings. So there's this process by which knowledge is shared throughout the different races and species as time goes on. And the Slan are at the root of all this, and they're at the root of perhaps the most important part of the whole setting, the presence of chaos. And at this point, we should point out the Slan and Lizardmen, completely different. Later on, the Slan and Lizardmen will be one and the same, with the Lizardmen being servants / peers to the Slan. But in this, the Lizardmen, they are chaotic creatures of a different origin. The Slan are actually the whole group that occupies that part of the New World in the south in Lustria, and that's like all those guys. So what happens is the Slan can travel through space and time using a complicated network of space travel. They have polar gateways on the north and south poles of this world. These gates collapse. This has happened because of malfunction, because of the presence of malign influence. The chaos gods in this setting have not yet been defined as they are going to be as the primary 4, sometimes 5, sometimes 6, but as the primary gods. That comes later. So at this stage, they imply a malign intellect of immense power, which sounds a lot like a chaos god, but it's not necessarily. But anyways, these polar gates are destroyed. When they collapse, they shower the world with interdimensional chaotic energy from the void. At this point, creatures multidimensional and demonic in origin that were once held at bay and placated by the Slan escape, and the energy of chaos enters the world and begins to change the course of life. So what happens is, it's almost like where you were in your state of progress is how hard chaos is going to punch you in the gut. So the elves, right, they had spent a lot of time with the Slan. They had been moved to their islands in the middle of the sea. They had been developing their own technology. They were advanced with magic. They were doing their own thing. And they were influenced by the power of chaos, and it led to, in some respects, there being the classic elf civil war and sundering of the peoples where the dark elves are created. Like that happens, but they don't suffer the same types of afflictions that dwarves do a little bit and humans do a lot of it. So it's based on where the placement of you is, of where your progress is, of where you is, if you understand what I'm saying. And when we go into this, they even make reference to something that won't really be touched on a lot more, but they even say lawful entities. So lawful aligned gods existed and arrived in this time and were contained within the multitudes of chaos that were brought to the world through the shattering of the gates.
it's really interesting how this is, like, as you said, it isn't necessarily invalidated by later editions, but more just sort of ignored or glossed over. Another element that I've noticed in the sort of reading of that description is that they kind of reuse that origin for what would be the Warhammer 40,000 universe with the old ones, and they change the players around. You'll end up with Necrons being the more of the focal point, and then later elves and orcs.
Yes.
But you can see it's like a remixed version of this. I thought that was interesting. It has a very, I mean, having written lore for my games and with other things that I've worked on, I do know that habit of trying not to waste anything I already thought of.
Yeah, I do know what you mean.
And I can see that here. It's like, maybe we'll make this more of a fantasy world, but maybe that's a good idea. We'll rework it.
I mean, the old saying goes, a good GM never wastes their prep, right?
Exactly. I just see that that use every part mentality carried over in the history of both games, which I thought is actually pretty interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And continuing with this vast timeline of the old world, we'll next get to the history of the elves, because they're guided by the Slann before the Slann's fall, and they are the chosen children to a certain effect. But after the Slann fall, they then have their civil war against the Dark Elves, who are then banished to the west. The elves at that point go through a series of peace for centuries, perhaps a millennia, and it's a pretty good time. The dwarves expand and create their nations in the World Edge Mountains, so the spine of the world, these gigantic mountain range that they do describe in this as being just vast beyond our imagination. And it's there that a conflict breaks out between the elves and dwarves. This war is later characterized as the War of the Beard, but at this stage, it's not really given that much detail, but there is a super violent war between the elves and the dwarves, and it both expels the elves from the continent of the old world, save some who live on as the wood elves, but it does shatter the dwarves. They lose massive numbers of their population, and much of their strength is lost. This then continues the tragedy, where the dwarves are met with calamity by a series of volcanic eruptions ripping through the World's Edge Mountains. So the dwarven nation that had been built, which was so vast that you could travel from the peaks of the mountains from the north to the south entirely underground, that had been shattered by volcanic eruptions. This both creates the Dark Lands, the Wolf Lands to the east, but it also, because they're showered in ash, covered in debris from this series of eruptions, but the dwarves lose their underground communication networks, their tunnels. Terrible monsters come up from below as a result of this, and it largely takes the dwarves from the dominant power of the continental old world and shifts them backwards a significant amount. And this is where the development of humans and their little buddies, the halflings, come into primary effect. And at first, they're treated as a curiosity, but then they partner with the dwarves. And it is during the Goblin Wars that humanity really earns their spurs, as it were. And with the help of Sigmar and the leaders of the human tribes and communities, they work with the dwarves and win at Blackfire Pass and put paid to the Orc menace. So that is a huge series of events. It's actually quite a detailed history that'll later get filled in, but here it's still there. It's just at its, the very foundation of that idea. So once we've gone through all of that history that effectively brings us up to the major nations at play in the old world. So we're going to get a depiction of Bretonnia in good detail. We're going to get the Empire in good detail. We also get the minor powers in more detail than they are normally given. So that's going to include Astalia, Tilia, and the Wasteland. So you'll get a unique insight into their culture, into some of the national motivations, and their geography. And the old world, as we mentioned earlier, is very much a weird world of our own history. So there are direct analogs to these different nations, to our own past. So Tilia is very obviously the Italian city-states, whereas the Empire is the Holy Roman Empire. So there are many parallels, but it's very cool to get at least the Warhammer-fied version of these states depicted in some detail. And there is extensive notes on the geography of the old world, of the mountains, the rivers, some of the soil conditions are even discussed in different regions. So there's some actual attention to detail here to try and help give this world a sense of verisimilitude that helps you believe in the people who live there. And I love that. I think that is what makes a setting. It's not like the cool plot MacGuffins that exist. It's more like, what's it like to live in that world?
Yeah.
And in this world, it's like a cursed folklore version of our world. So it's very interesting. And it also has this really neat trick. Because the setting is not so defined, and because they don't have the same like gigantic world map that has every village drawn on it yet, what they've done is they've given you a settlement pattern for the empire. So if there's a city here, at what distance would you have towns and townlands, and then market cities, and then villages and little fishing communities? And instead of it pinning down on the map every single village that you would always encounter, it's more a suggestion of how the GM will create their own villages to fill in that map content.
Yeah, I really love when games do that stuff, where they might have some fixed like major points in a setting, but that it's more of a probabilistic cloud about, oh, well, yeah, there's room enough for this town and this town and this. And that's one of the things, like, as you're saying, like the fact that it's weird to say, because when you look at Warhammer lore now, and especially with things like Age of Sigmar, it's very hard to imagine it being grounded.
Yes.
But at this stage, I think for me, the thing that I liked about and still like about the Warhammer fantasy setting is how grounded it feels most of the time.
Yeah.
Like, obviously there are these massive battles and huge events, and people are fighting demons and vampire lords and all kinds of stuff. And I don't want to say it's a bit of a kitchen sink fantasy. There's certainly settings that I can think of that are more like that. But even when it's doing that, it's still focused on the sort of, I don't want to say day to day, but like you can feel the ground beneath your feet most of the time.
You still have an army made of halberdiers with mud on them, you know?
Yeah.
And I like that. And I think that's endearing in a way. We mentioned how this is the start of grimdark role playing, and that underscores, like, even in the way the setting thinks about itself, it's not a place where the heroic rise to the top. It's like the heroic might get the job done, but they get smacked down a little bit in the process. A way I had heard Warhammer Fantasy roleplay campaigns described is sort of having an inverse progression where you start as someone who has something, and then as each session goes, you're losing more. You may be gaining experience, but you're losing sanity, you're losing your coin and your possessions, and you're getting to the bottom of the mystery, or you're vanquishing the chaos monster, but it's taking everything from your character to do it. And I think that has a really cool appeal. It's kind of has sort of like it's like the anti-hero of role-playing games, as opposed to being a paladin and coming back to the village.
Yeah.
And being welcomed in with open arms. You know, when you come back to the village, there's a warrant for your arrest.
There's I don't want to call it cynical, but there's something of that kind of lurking in the background. And I honestly think that that's, like, people use the term grimdark to mean a lot of things, but I honestly think that that's what it's grounded in. It's grounded in that mud and blood and a little bit of cynicism. And upward from that, we create these like, yeah, it's a hellscape, or some parts of it are. But I don't feel that just referring to the thing as a hellscape necessarily makes it grimdark. I think for my understanding, it has that sense of grounded realism, that almost brutally grounded might be a way to put it.
Yeah, I agree. And just to finish up here on this section of lore, it'll end by giving you a really good breakdown of how travel works in the current day empire. Because as the lore section goes, it kind of it starts off like being lizardmen from space, but it narrows its way down to being, how do you travel down a highway in the present day empire? So it sort of finds its focus as it goes on in these chapters. But it discusses travel by coach and travel by riverway. So you have two different ways as your primary modes of transport, we'll call them. And they're given some details, including what a coaching inn's like, which is really cool because a lot of us think of the inn or the tavern house, but we sort of have this like straw roofed sort of one wood table in the middle of the room, with a goat in the corner. And this is like a professional establishment, a coaching inn, there are booking appointments and stuff. So it's very different. And I actually kind of like that about this setting too. Even though it's medieval and Renaissance by its nature, it also plays with some modernity in some of the ways it handles itself in the setting to kind of give you as a modern player more to hold on to.
In the history of other older role-playing games, even Dungeons & Dragons flirts with the idea of science fiction being an element of fantasy, the sort of science fantasy element. So it's not unheard of up to this point, but this is a very integrated way of putting those elements as part of a setting. It almost like it starts off in the sort of science fictional vagaries, and then it turns into more of this traditional fantasy. So from there, we kind of move into elements like we've got a bestiaries, and there's a whole kind of range of monsters. Some of them have a classic kind of appeal that are unique to Warhammer itself. Some are things that are obviously holdovers, probably because they had miniatures from Citadel that matched it. So you gotta have orcs because we already made orcs, and orcs are fun, and it's in Lord of the Rings, therefore you gotta have orcs. Goblins, same thing. There are some cool things. Chaos Beastmen are become a staple, one of my favorite enemies. Just because it's that permutation of chaos being tied to the animalistic and creating essentially animal-human hybrids.
Yeah, totally.
There's also one of the classic enemies, which I don't think has a context outside of Warhammer, which is the Fimir.
Yes, they show up in all the editions of the role-playing game, and I don't think that they have anywhere else they pop up, but they're in every edition of this game.
They even show up in things like Hero Quest, interestingly enough, or certain editions of it anyway. So clearly that's a much beloved monster type, which is odd because they're just described as kind of half demon, half human things.
Yeah, like giant lizard ogre guys.
Yeah, they're kind of cycloptic, spike-tailed ogre things. But when you go into the bestiary, they got like a whole page dedicated to them and another page which is just art. They are much beloved even at this point.
They got prime real estate.
I thought that was kind of interesting. And then you got your giants, your gnomes, your goblins, all of your fantasy standards, hobgoblins, which have an interesting history in the fantasy Warhammer setting. They kind of drift in and out in importance. Lizardmen, of course, being another one of those big ones. Orcs, ogres, quite a lot of dedicated to that. And for some of you out there that love ratty things, they have Skaven, which I think may have been introduced in an earlier edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battle, but really gets fleshed out here. They get a whole page, though it is combined with art. It is, for what is written there, pretty thorough.
This is where they come into their own.
And they will become another one of those fan favorites. And then you got undead, tree men, trolls. Oh, Chaos Warriors. That's one of my favorites. And yeah, all kinds of monsters and beasties, and a lot of them are classic. Some of them are just natural animals, but yeah, they're quite thorough with that section. Most of everything from ordinary bugs and birds to dragons, essentially.
Yeah, it's quite a diverse list of everything.
Yeah, and it's very indicative of a game of this era where they basically are like, oh yeah, you got to have that, and you got to have that, and they just cram it full of stuff, which I love, even if there's only like, a little paragraph.
And it's interesting how this bestiary kind of sets up a lot of what you're going to see in the future editions and future pieces of the old world lore.
Yeah.
Because I think that's the big impact of this book. It sets up the old world in a way earlier editions of the Fantasy Battles game did not. They didn't go into the setting in any meaningful way like this book does. This book gives us the creation timeline of the setting. This book gives us the nations and their relationships, the geography. It's like without this, the new old world that we are seeing from Games Workshop wouldn't be able to exist at all.
Yeah.
Without this, there wouldn't be the Total War PC games that are so big. You know, a lot of these things could never have existed, even though they have nothing to do with an RPG, without this RPG.
There's only so much lore, especially in those early Warhammer products, that you could squeeze in next to all the rules and how do you paint this and how do you mount that. And, you know, there's only so much book space. The nice thing about a role-playing game is that you can fill it out with a lot of that. And then the importance of that then gets lodged into the creator's brain. And then now they're carrying that forward and trying to bring more of that, especially when you end up with the faction books and all this other stuff for the war game.
Yeah.
They end up revisiting, but it really feels like this is where they got it all down. I mean, evidently they got down more than they ended up using, but still, it's really interesting to see that. And then, finally, we've got an adventure called the Oldenhaller Contract.
Yes.
And it's sort of it's just kind of an introductory thing, and it's nice that they've included something that you can play right out of the box.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think we've kind of gone on long enough about that, but I do invite people to find a version of this because there is more than one version of it, and it is considered a classic in most editions.
Yeah, for good reason too.
You know, I don't want to ruin anybody's potential campaign or even a one shot by giving it away, but I would say that it is good, and especially for an older product, I was actually pretty impressed. So that then is Warhammer Fantasy Role Playing First Edition. Any other final thoughts?
I'm excited to run this in its modern edition. This really influenced and inspired my thoughts for how I want to look at this setting in the future. I think there's a lot of cool bits of detail in here. And with it being in the minds of gamers right now, with there being like, you know, a resurgence of this setting, I think it's cool to see where it starts and where a lot of these ideas come from.
Yeah, 100%. Like, there's definitely a wealth of knowledge here. And even if, like, you might not run this version, but man, there's a lot of good thoughts and ideas. And if you're just like us and you like reading old stuff that has been developed further along the line, then this is a good book. Definitely pick it up and give it a read.
And next week, we are going to tackle a topic that is going to be a little different. It's still within the wheelhouse, but it'll be Hero Quest, one of the first and most important of the adventure board games. This feels like a role-playing game in some regards, feels like a board game, even feels like a skirmish miniatures game. So it does so many things, and it does them well.
Yeah, and it's Warhammer adjacent.
Yeah.
More so in later edition or later iterations of it, less so in some. But yeah, we will come back to you next episode with an exciting breakdown of Hero Quest. And until then, good gaming to everyone, and we'll see you then.